Hello, my name is Sally Bloom. I'm an educator here at the North Carolina Museum of History. Today we're in the Story of North Carolina, our exhibit on 14,000 years of North Carolina history. And behind me you can see a plaster replica of a statue of George Washington that was originally in the state capitol building when it looked like it did in this painting here around 1815, when the statue was commissioned from the Italian sculptor Canova, who was recommended to us by President Thomas Jefferson. The statue was very popular, visited by lots of people, until a fire destroyed the Capitol and the statue in 1831. Over 100 years later, the original drawings and studies of that statue were found, and now we have the plaster copy of that, and a reproduction is in the State Capitol building that you can visit anytime. Today I want to share with you a story about another image of George Washington, and it concerns a North Carolinian, Dolley Madison, who was born here in North Carolina. The book is called Dolley Madison Saves George Washington. It's written and illustrated by Don Brown. Everybody talked about Dolley Madison. They talked about her charm and grace. They talked about her beauty, her stunning gowns, and her delightful banquets. Everybody loves Mrs. Madison. That's because Mrs. Madison loves everybody, they said. It was a surprising turn for the one-time farm girl, whose early years had not included grand parties and fancy clothes. Then she married James Madison in 1794 and joined his hectic political life. James Madison was a great man of the Revolution, a founding father. In the early days of the American Republic, he became President Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. Jefferson, a widower with no wife of his own, enlisted Dolley to be something of his first lady and entertain politicians and foreign leaders. She threw wonderful dinner parties and even honored Lewis and Clark with the celebration before their daunting overland journey to the Pacific Ocean. Dolley became the capital's leading hostess. Dolley's reputation grew when James Madison became president in 1808. As the actual First Lady, she arranged weekly get-togethers, drawing rooms, she called them. Good-natured Dolley treated all her guests like family or long-lost friends, and she had a smile and a pleasant word for everybody. Her beautiful gowns and outrageous turbans of satin and gold and ostrich feathers dazzled all. Everyone ached to attend the drawing rooms. Despite the busy social world, Dolley still had the president's mansion to manage. She saw a sore need for redecorating and threw herself to the task. Custom-made furniture, hand-woven carpet, and velvet curtains were carefully selected. In the dining room, she reserved a place for a remarkable life-size portrait of George Washington. The painting by the well-known artist Gilbert Stuart had been in the mansion since 1800. It portrayed the first president not like a king, but as the country's leading private citizen, highlighting America's preference for democracy instead of royalty. The painting also showed the respect and love everyone had for Washington, feelings that Dolley surely shared. In fact, Washington was more than a war hero and great statesman to Dolley. She was related to him through her sister's marriage to Washington's nephew. But in 1812, talk of Dolley's redecorating her glamorous clothes and her drawing rooms paled beside a bitter American and English quarrel. Each country felt the other meant it harm. "You side with our enemies," English cried. "You kidnap our sailors," Americans roared. Finally, the arguments exploded into war. Battles blazed on land and sea. Then, in 1814, Britain invaded America, and thousands of English soldiers stalked the Washington, D.C. countryside. Dolley's terrified friends fled. Dolley did not. August 22 found her with the spyglass in hand at the top window of the president's mansion, watching with unwearied anxiety for the president, her dear husband, in the field with his army. She later wrote that she saw only groups of military wandering in all directions, as if there were a lack of arms or the spirit to fight. Suddenly, a dust-covered messenger on horseback galloped up to the president's house and warned that the British were near. The 100 soldiers that were supposed to be guarding the presidential mansion ran off. Dolley did not. Deserted by nearly everyone, Dolley must have had the good sense to run away, too. And who would expect otherwise from her? She was not a soldier, but a socialite, more familiar with the whistle of flutes than the whistle of bullets. But in the moment, she leapt to action, grabbing important government papers and other valuables to rescue. Then she remembered George Washington. Dolley refused to surrender the cherished painting to the sure destruction by the English soldiers. Delaying her escape, she commanded 2 servants to take the portrait from the wall. They fumbled with the screws. Dolley ordered the frame broken. The men shattered the wood with a hatchet and freed the painting. 2 good citizens appeared, and Dolley instructed them to save that picture. Only then did she race for safety. Dashing through the city, she met James near the banks of the Potomac River. Before he returned to the fighting, the couple promised to reunite later at a distant tavern. The city of Washington burned, and flames lit the distant sky. Dolley took to the roads, jammed with fleeing wagons and carts. Dolley made her way to the tavern, but instead of James, she found a crowd of outraged women who blamed the president for the fighting and destruction by the British. "Your husband has got mine out fighting," they bawled. "You shan't stay in this house, so get out." Dolley retreated to another inn, arriving just as black thunder muttered, forked lightning flashed, and hurricane blast announced a tornado which broke forth with tropical fury. Disguised as a simple farm woman, Dolley escaped to the countryside as the British ransacked Washington. She returned after several days, later saying, "I cannot tell you what I felt on re-entering the capital. Such destruction, such confusion. The British fleet full in view, and at night the rockets were seen flying near us." She and James reunited. They mourned the destruction of Washington, but took heart from an American victory at Baltimore Harbor in Maryland. An onlooker there, Francis Scott Key, described the battle in a poem that would eventually become the national anthem. When people learned there was more to Dolley Madison than satin gowns and dainty cakes, they called her one of the bravest soldiers of the war. Months later, the British and Americans ended their war. They burned President's Mansion, would be rebuilt, its charred stone walls painted white, prompting people to call it the White House. Dolley went on throwing more parties and met or befriended almost every important person in America's early history, including the first 11 presidents. And what became of George Washington's portrait? It escaped the British and returned to the White House, where it remains on display today, just as Dolley would have wished it.